Hello everyone, Subhash here. Now we are going to listen to podcast news which includes editorials. While walking in the morning or evening, while cooking, cycling or during free time you can listen. It will enhance your learning and understanding of various accents and pronunciations. Listening improves the quality of communication and comprehension. Before going ahead, I would like to welcome you all to the virtual school. A new way of learning and teaching, with the vision of let's grow together. Our mission is to learn how to learn and teach how to teach. So stay tuned. And here we go. Editorial 1. Small dose says the first relief package for the second COVID-19 wave falls short of expectations. After asserting that people should wait for the union budget's announcements to trickle down before seeking a fresh stimulus to cope with the second wave of the pandemic, the government finally unveiled a relief package of sorts this Monday. The financial implications of the measures, such as the promise of easy small-ticket loans for 25 lakh micro-entrepreneurs and 11,000 tourist agents and free tourist visas, have been projected at about 6 rupees and 29 paise lakh crore by the Finance Ministry. Nearly 2 rupees and 68 paise lakh crore of this is in the form of credit guarantees. A further rupee 1.5 lakh crore of guarantees has been promised to add to the 3 rupees lakh crore emergency credit scheme, but the scheme's tenure hasn't been extended beyond September 30th. Similar backing has been announced for loans worth 60,000 rupees crore to COVID-affected sectors, but only tourism has been publicly identified. Enhancing loan guarantees will perhaps give risk-averse lenders more confidence in extending loans when the credit-deposit ratio has hit a multi-year low. But there is little to make such loans viable by stirring demand for goods and services. Free visas are a good idea but are unlikely to gain traction till India has a firmer grip on the pandemic by providing vaccines for all, including for those under 18. Loans of 1 rupee lakh to 10 rupees lakh for travel agents may help meet some liabilities or expenses but won't make people take holidays. Just like last year's 20 rupees lakh crore package, the actual outgo from the exchequer this time is minimal and the direct stimulus to demand abysmal. Additional spending of 15,000 rupees crore to ramp up pediatric healthcare, with guarantees for 50,000 rupees crore low-interest loans for health projects in the hinterland, are critical to cope with future pandemic waves. It makes sense to direct resources towards health and faster vaccination. But the inclusion of measures already announced, such as fertilizer subsidies and food grains for the poor, along with spends planned over the next 2 or 5 years, and even a rupee 77.5 crore bailout plan for an ailing farm marketing firm, gives the package just extra padding. Investing time and resources to figure out some form of income support for the vulnerable sections in rural and urban areas would have been more helpful. Weak demand is a bigger concern for industry this year as high inflation, a propensity to save for future medical bills, and an uncertain job market have led to belt-tightening from consumers. If the government is hesitant about creating new doles for the fear of them becoming permanent features, it could have at least offered some immediate relief for all by addressing the elephant in the room: high fuel prices. This would dampen inflation, empower RBI to lend greater support to growth and leave a little more money in people's hands to spend. While the effort to maintain fiscal restraint may impress global rating agencies, they would be among the first to acknowledge that there's a tipping point where policy inaction risks hurting the economy's long-term prospects. Thank you. Editorial 2. Desert home: India seems to have warmed up to the UAE as a cricketing venue after earlier misgivings. The ICC 2020 World Cup's shift from India to the United Arab Emirates, UAE, was inevitable following recurrent waves of COVID-19 infections and the logistical difficulties of hosting an event featuring multiple squads. Over the last few weeks, the news first started as a source-based whisper before the Board of Control for Cricket in India, BCCI's top brass, President Sourav Ganguly and Secretary Jay Shah, spoke individually, clearly stating that India would host the championship in the UAE. Finally, the International Cricket Council issued a statement declaring that the tournament will be held from October 17 to November 14, with Oman stepping in as a co-host for the qualifiers. Once the BCCI scheduled the remainder of the Indian Premier League, IPL, in West Asia ahead of the T20 World Cup, it was no surprise that the Premier Championship too would follow suit. With its 3 grounds at Dubai, Abu Dhabi and Sharjah being in close proximity, the UAE cuts out the need for air travel, and teams can adhere to biobubbles in their respective hotels, an essential requirement in these fraught times of a constantly mutating virus. India hosted England earlier this year and the IPL too commenced this summer, but the pandemic's surge meant that the league had to be suspended while a second wind was sought in the desert sands prior to the T20 World Cup. That for a year India paused its domestic cricket makes it all the more difficult for it to suddenly lend its weight to international fixtures at home. Now that the ambivalence has been shed, it is interesting to note the emergence of the UAE as a popular neutral venue. Fans of a certain vintage would recall past jousts at Sharjah lit up by the legendary exploits of stars ranging from Javed Miandad to Sachin Tendulkar. And then India stayed away for a while as talk about bookies and off-field corrupt influences surfaced. Meanwhile, terrorism-scarred Pakistan kept the UAE as its home venue as nervous rivals refused to land either at Karachi or Lahore. Since then, India has warmed up to the UAE as a cricketing outpost while Pakistan has found a few visitors willing to play on its turf. As a second host for the IPL, the UAE has always stepped forward and India had an instant solution for its T20 World Cup hosting crisis. After winning the inaugural ICC World T20 in South Africa back in 2007, India has suffered a title drought and there is a case for course correction. But before that, its dual units have to tackle 6 limited overs contests in Sri Lanka and 5 tests in England. Thank you. Editorial 3. How the Chinese Communist Party endures in large measure it is due to the party's ability to sum up the lessons of history and change course quite drastically, if required. Citizens in China encapsulate the transformation of the country under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, CPC, thus, under Mao Zedong, China, Zhang Qilai, stood up, under Deng Xiaoping, China, Fu Qilai, became rich, and under Xi Jinping, China is well on course to, Qian Qilai, becoming powerful. Inevitably, the organization that has steered this rise, and its ability to ride out a succession of domestic and external crises and yet emerge stronger and more resilient has been the cynosure of intense debates. The CPC's longevity is due in large measure to its ability to sum up the lessons of history and change course quite drastically, if required. While the Mao, Deng and Xi periods are conventional markers to distinguish the shifts and departures over the past 70 years, it would be an error to assess China as if it was born in 1949. The long story is something the Chinese communists take very seriously. This analysis seeks to identify 5 major lessons that have guided the CPC over the course of the past century. The birth of a new China. The first major lesson was drawn from the colonial era, when China was carved up like a melon, and the humiliation heaped by the Western colonial powers. The collapse of the Qing Empire in 1911 brought about the desired political revolution and China entered the Committee of Nations. The location of the CPC in the sensibilities and imagination of the Chinese people today cannot be understood without reference to what was actually accomplished by the victory of the CPC first over the Japanese and then the Kuomintang in 1949. The Communist Party was on the right side of history. It fused the people with a collective purpose, the rejuvenation of China, and gave them a national identity. With its ideology and superb organizational skills and the assistance of a lean but highly disciplined People's Liberation Army to power its sinews, the CPC combined the thousands of sparks that were simmering throughout the country into one big explosive social revolution, demolishing an entire social class. This was liberation, not mere independence, and the birth of a new China, encapsulated in the popular post-1949 slogan, May you Gong Chungadang, May you Xins Hongagao. If there had been no Communist Party, there would not have been a new China. Such a comprehensive political, economic and social destruction, as it were, is unparalleled in the history of modern revolutions. This historical experience underpinned Mao's nationalist message on 1 October 1949, China had stood up, and it would never let itself be humiliated again. It was not until well into the Deng period that the theme of humiliation was encountered less frequently, but the importance of standing up to external forces that seek to impose their ways has endured. Strong responses to any perceived attack on sovereignty, Tibet and Taiwan, for instance, the categorical rejection of anything that could be interpreted as a dilution of national interest or the determined pushback of attempts to impose or lecture about Western values are cases in point. The wolf warrior diplomacy in recent times can be seen against that backdrop. The authority and power of the ruling elite in China can under no circumstances be undermined in the eyes of its people. The second signal lesson came out of the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. But Marxism had to be Sinicized before it could be applied to the Chinese conditions. Mao took the revolution from the cities to the countryside and in the process, imparted to the Chinese Revolution a populist character that the Bolshevik Revolution did not have. The concept of Sinicization is essentially a tool for grounding any foreign concept or idea in the Chinese conditions. It was seen in the post-1949 strategies of economic development and industrialization when China rejected both the Soviet and the capitalist model. Over the years, the process of Sinicization has morphed into socialism with Chinese characteristics. It is in this vein that Mr. Xi speaks about the need to adapt Marxism to China's modern requirements. Lessons from Tiananmen. Political centralization had inevitably come on the heels of the revolution, though the CPC under both Mao and Deng attempted to balance it with decentralization. And then came the third historical lesson, out of the Tiananmen crisis of 1989. The simmering dissatisfaction stemming from the uneven impact of Deng's reforms and the problem of corruption in the CPC since the mid-1980s burst out in massive demonstrations and more critically, from the CPC's point of view, fostered a sense of solidarity among the students and workers. The demonstrations were crushed by a massive use of force. For Deng the lesson was that if China was to achieve its economic objectives, it could not afford chaos. Stability was accorded top priority and the nation's energies channelized into getting rich, which has continued to be the chief plank of the CPC's governance after Deng down to Mr. Xi. Inevitably, that translated into clamping down on political freedoms, and centralizing tendencies gained the upper hand. As ideology declines, the dependence on the organization in holding the country together increases and makes imperative the need for a strong leader who can ensure that stability. This has reached unprecedented levels with Mr. Xi ensuring that every unit of political, economic, social and cultural organization in China is not only juxtaposed with the CPC but also functions within the parameters set by the party. The fourth lesson stemmed from the defining structural transformation of the post-World War II international order, the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Socialist bloc in 1991. The rejection of the Stalinist period by the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was highly problematic. As Deng told his comrades, "You cannot and must not deny your history." Recall the official assessment, Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. But more importantly, it underscored the necessity of a strong party state and its firm control over the market forces. Over the years, this has only been affirmed with greater conviction. Finally, we have a slew of lessons spilling out since China decided to dispense with its low profile in foreign affairs. The People's Republic of China, PRC, has donned the mantle of a great power with aplomb. It thinks like a great power and to that extent, it will follow the logic of power in its dealings with the world. The aftermath of the pandemic provided Mr. Xi with the opportunity to demonstrate that the PRC is a responsible major power. The world's response and acceptance are mixed. The CPC would do well to reflect on the lessons that need to be drawn about the reactions to its assertiveness. Costs of success. Bringing nearly 800 million people out of poverty is an amazing achievement, whichever way you see it, but it has come with huge domestic costs. China is one of the most unequal societies in the world today. Its unprecedented growth has created unparalleled environmental challenges spilling beyond its borders. Rapidly shrinking state welfare packages have made the increasing population of the elderly more vulnerable. and it is struggling with a disturbing gender imbalance. There are certainly many lessons here, as Manoranjan Mohanty's book, China's Transformation, The Success Story and the Success Trap, points out, about how not to grow. It is more important than ever to understand the nature and power of this organization, its strengths and weaknesses, its ability to capture the imagination of the people, and interestingly, the youth. It has refuted prognostications of its demise with its capacity for reinventing, regenerating and renewing its compact with the people, strengthened, among other things, by its ability to continue learning from history. The world is dealing not merely with a nation-state but with an authoritarian party-state that foregrounds its civilizational culture, and at its helm is an organization that is steering the country towards its own tryst with destiny. It remains to be seen whether the CPC is still on the right side of history, but the party is by no means over. Alka Acharya is Professor of Chinese Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Honorary Fellow, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Views are personal. Thank you. Editorial 4. An attempt to silence the film fraternity. The proposed amendments to the cinematograph law will prevent filmmakers from making certain kinds of films. Can we remain silent when there is a proposal to muzzle our society's voice of creativity and reflection? I have always believed in the power of cinema to transform society, and I still do. The belief stems from my personal experiences as a filmmaker, and I have also seen firsthand what it is to defend one's constitutional rights. The recent action of the central government is one such. I am referring to the Draft Cinematograph Amendment Bill 2021, for which the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has asked for opinions before presenting it to Parliament. The draft bill, my icon, M.K. Gandhi, failed to realize the full potential of cinema, and so did E.V. Ramasamy. Imagine if righteous people like them had taken cognizance of this platform. The power of this medium has made me what I am today. Cinema is an author's medium. But it is also the voice of the people, and hence the voice of the institution of democracy. Now the central government is keen to seize that voice of democracy by a single act of Parliament. The Draft Cinematograph Amendment Bill proposes to add a proviso to subsection 1 of Section 6 of the Cinematograph Act to grant revisionary powers to the central government to direct re-examination of films that have already been certified for public exhibition. This is done predominantly with a view to empower the government to interfere and influence the independence of the Central Board of Film Certification, CBEFC, in certifying films and, more dangerously, to reopen records of already certified films. It is pertinent that we understand the present scenario to clearly perceive the excess of the proposed amendment. While the current censorship rules are archaic and redundant, and we have been crying ourselves hoarse to abolish the same, inviting artists to be their own censors, the amendment to provide for revisionary powers to any government after certification is a step further back. This amendment comes close on the heels of the government's decision, in April 2021, to abolish the Film Certification Appellate Tribunal. Consequently, the only resort available now to any filmmaker who is aggrieved by a decision of the CBEFC is to approach the relevant High Court, which would be too expensive and time-consuming for most filmmakers. Through this amendment, the central government has sought to usurp powers that are held to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of India. Portions of Section 6(1) of the Principal Act were held to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Union of India v. K.M. Shankarappa, 2000. The court held that Section 6(1) is a travesty of the rule of law, which is one of the basic structures of the Constitution. Revisionary powers. The impression that the central government is trying to create now is that it is powerless to act against complaints received. I had the experience of a state government acting on a complaint and an imaginary scenario. I did showcase my film before its release to my brethren, who expressed their apprehensions even after the censor board certified it. The imbroglio created over the film's supposedly inflammatory nature led to the closing of doors of theaters in my own state, all due to political machinations. It is that avenue which this amendment opens out to any government to use its revisionary powers, which it anyway has. The government is well empowered to act against complaints received, by submitting itself to judicial review against decisions of the CBEF granting certification, instead of trying to impose executive access, which was the core principle laid down by the Supreme Court through its order. The central government seems to have manipulated and maneuvered this situation since the tribunal has recently been struck down. The draft bill will only restrict freedom of speech and put a gag on the film fraternity, preventing filmmakers from making films on bad governance, social evils, and so on. Further, any executive authority may be emboldened to ban films based on frivolous petitions of groups with vested interests or fringe groups. In this age of the internet, every person is more than a mere soapbox orator. The government is aiming to silence its people. All those who trust and are invested in liberty, equality and fraternity should voice their protest. If temporary myopia is the problem of certain sections of the media and other political parties, then the Mughal Nidhi Mayam and I will become the torchbearer. The time to rally is now, since the government has invited comments from the public till July 2 before the bill is taken to Parliament. Acts once passed will affect generations to come. Kamal Hassan is a filmmaker and artist and president of the Mughal Nidhi Mayam. Thank you. Editorial 5. Interview Vertical Bar Montek Singh Ahluwalia India's 1991 liberalization leap and lessons for today. The reforms were hugely successful, but a lot remains to be done, says one of the architects of the transition. Vikas Duk. 3 decades after India embarked upon the path of economic liberalization, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, one of the key figures of the reform process, former deputy chairman of the erstwhile Planning Commission and currently distinguished fellow at the Centre for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, discusses in an interview with The Hindu the transition of the Indian economy, what remains to be done, and the road ahead after recovery from the slowdown induced by the COVID-19 pandemic. Edited excerpts. How would you describe the evolution of the economy since 1991? The reforms were aimed at unleashing the energies of the private sector to accelerate economic growth and to do so in a manner that ensured an adequate flow of benefits to the poor. They certainly succeeded in this objective. The full benefits took time to materialize because a gradualist approach was adopted, entirely understandable in a democracy, but the results are dramatic if we look at a longer time frame. The GDP growth averaged 7% in the 25 years from 1992 to 2017, compared with an average of 5% in the preceding 10 years and 4% in the preceding 20. And as growth accelerated, poverty declined. Between May 2004 and 2011 to 12, the last year for which official data on poverty are available, about 140 million people were pulled above the poverty line. This is not to say that there were no shortcomings. Some of the reforms begun in 1991, especially in the financial sector, have yet to be completed. We have not done as much as we should have in the health and education sectors. Environmental concerns have not been adequately built into our development strategy. In his book Confessions of a Swadeshi Reformer, former Union Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha has said that a lot of the blueprint for the liberalization was already on the table when the Narasimha Rao government took charge. Could you give us a glimpse of that period and what were the key changes being worked out before the change of the regime? I have written on this subject in my book Backstage, but let me attempt a brief encapsulation. To get a glimpse of the period, one should consider the main features of the control system before the reforms and see how it restricted entrepreneurship. The private sector was not allowed to invest in a number of sectors thought to be critical for development. The so-called commanding heights were reserved for the public sector despite its lackluster performance. Where the private sector was allowed, it could invest only after getting an industrial license, and that was especially hard to get for large industrial houses. Over 860 items were reserved exclusively for small-scale producers, including many that had very high export potential. Imports were more strictly controlled than in almost any other developing country because it was felt necessary to conserve scarce foreign exchange. Consumer goods simply could not be imported, so domestic producers faced no import competition. Producers could import capital goods and intermediates needed for production, but this generally required an import license. This was given only if the government was satisfied that the import was essential and domestic substitutes were not available. Finally, the import of technology was controlled and foreign direct investment, FDI, was discouraged. It was clearly not a system geared to encourage enterprise or innovation. I am reminded of George Santayana's much-quoted words, "Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it." Since most of the population today has no recollection of the control system we had earlier, I hope it will serve to ensure that we never slip back to these absurdities. Efforts were made in the 1980s to liberalize the system, but these were incremental changes. The system itself remained in place. By 1990, it was clear that drastic change was needed. I had the opportunity to prepare a paper outlining a core set of industrial and trade policy reforms, combined with exchange rate reform and reforms in the public sector. This paper, dubbed by the media as the M document, generated a great deal of controversy, but several people supported the need for these reforms. Around that time, the Ministry of Industry under Ajit Singh, newly returned from the United States, proposed bold liberalization of industrial licensing, but he was opposed by the Finance Ministry under Madhu Dandavate, and only a watered-down version was announced. As Commerce Secretary in the Chandrasekhar government, I started working on trade policy reforms along the lines suggested in the M document, including bringing in EXIM scripts, as a first step in moving to a flexible exchange rate. In April 1991, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was then advisor to Prime Minister Chandrasekhar, delivered the convocation address at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, where he outlined what he thought were the key reforms needed. It included many of the suggestions in the M document, and went beyond them. In other words, the ideas that finally went into the reforms were on the table before 1991. But they had not been approved politically. It was the P.V. Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh duo that implemented them in 1991. The fact that the economy was in a crisis helped, but their success is also due to the fact that there was a well-thought-out policy package to implement. Even so, it was not easy. Both the right and the left opposed the reforms. The Congress party itself had many who were not convinced. Indian businesses were also conflicted. They liked domestic liberalization, but were unhappy at the entry of foreign competition, both through imports and FDI. Some pending factor market reforms, in areas such as labor and land, remain hanging. Are they not holding up investment? Yes, these are key pending items. The need for labor market reforms was recognized, but it was thought that we should first get the industrial, trade and financial sector reforms to show positive results and take up labor market reforms later. In a meeting with businessmen in 2006, PM Manmohan Singh was asked about labor market reforms. He said, "If we could get the economy to grow at 10%, it would be easier to persuade labor." We did grow at over 9% for a few years, but persuading labor proved to be difficult. On the land market, I must admit that it was not on our agenda. One reason is that land is a state subject and the center had enough on its plate. In the UPA, United Progressive Alliance, years, it did get involved in land acquisition because this was an area with a lot of agitation and allegations of heavy-handedness. Unfortunately, the resulting legislation introduced too many conditions, which could greatly delay the process. India progressively lowered import tariffs from an estimated 57.5% in 1992 to 8.9% in 2008, but this trend has been reversed over the past few years. While this appears to be in line with rising protectionism globally, can India afford to do this if it wants to play a greater role in world trade? I feel the reversal of a trend that was followed by several governments, including the NDA, National Democratic Alliance, government under former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, is unfortunate. It will hamper our stated ambition to become part of global supply chains. Indian industry has legitimate complaints about poor infrastructure, poor logistics and time-consuming trade procedures, which reduce its competitiveness. But the solution lies in addressing these problems directly, not in raising import duties, which will only raise costs in the economy. I also fear that once the government signals a willingness to raise duties to help individual products, it will encourage a flood of demands that will be difficult to resist. The government should engage with Indian industry and other experts to come to an agreement on what the average level of duties should be and how it should be reduced over time. The Niti Aayog under its first vice-chairman, Arvind Panagaria, had recommended that we should move to an average duty rate of about 7%, gradually narrowing the range of variation across products and eliminating duty reversals. This is the right approach. Should we revisit our stance on the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, even as we try to re-engage with markets such as the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union and Australia for free trade pacts? I was surprised by the Centre's decision to stay out of the RCEP. It went against the Prime Minister's earlier positive signal of moving from "Look East" to "Act East." I assume that there was lobbying from those who feared that the Indian industry would not be able to compete against China, a member of the RCEP. As I have already mentioned, the Indian industry has legitimate complaints about things that make India uncompetitive, and these must be addressed directly. The reduction in tariffs required under RCEP was to be accomplished over several years, giving ample time to take the steps needed to improve our competitiveness. As far as unfair competition from China is concerned, the solution lies in a faster method of imposing anti-dumping duties on China, not raising import duties across the board. We should note that geopolitics is forcing major countries to reduce dependence on China. India cannot expect to replace China, but it can reasonably expect to become a major player in non-China dominated supply chains. RCEP membership would help as it will reassure partners that trade policy will not be arbitrarily changed. As for free trade agreements, FTAs, with the US, Europe and the UK, we have traditionally preferred trade liberalization in a multilateral forum, but major developed countries seem to be moving away from multilateral negotiations. Working on agreements with important groups bilaterally seems to be the only hope for assuring market access. However, such FTAs will involve more give and take, including on contentious issues such as intellectual property rights and bilateral investment protection, and we must be willing to accept that. The spectre of jobless growth was a matter of great debate in the UPA years. Did the situation worsen post-UPA even before the pandemic, which of course has led to severe income and job losses? Employment was a matter of concern during the UPA period, but it had some positive features. The period was the first time we saw a fall in employment in agriculture, but it was accompanied by sufficient growth in total employment in non-agriculture sectors, so that the labor displaced from agriculture was absorbed in non-agriculture. Total employment actually increased. The post-UPA period before the pandemic has been analyzed in a recent study by Santosh Malhotra and Jajte K. Parida. They find that the substantial slowdown in GDP growth after 2016 to 17 led to employment actually falling from 474 million in 2011 to 12 to 469 million in 2018 to 19. Employment in agriculture continued to decline, reflecting a normal structural change, but unlike the UPA years, non-agricultural employment grew much more slowly. So, open unemployment increased. The problem was most severe among the youth, who experienced unemployment of 18%. The COVID-19 pandemic has of course triggered a collapse in employment. According to provisional national income estimates, GDP contracted by 7.3% in 2020 to 21. Many analysts say this underestimates the contraction as the adverse impact on the informal sector is not captured. In any case, a sharp fall in the GDP is bound to lead to a contraction in total employment, and we are seeing that in the data from the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. What do you think should be the priorities looking ahead? The economy is clearly recovering from the contraction induced by the pandemic, but how quickly it will recover is uncertain. Much depends upon whether we are hit by a third wave, and more importantly on how severe it is. The priority now must be to get the vaccination coverage expanded as soon as possible. This will create conditions conducive to a return to normalcy. However, recovery will only take us back to the 2019 to 20 level. If we only go back to the pre-pandemic growth rate of around 4% to 5%, we will get little respite on the employment front or on reducing poverty. Past experience shows that we need to get back to 7% to 8% growth if we want to make progress on poverty reduction and provide enough jobs for our growing labor force. Once the pandemic is brought under control and we are back to the 2019-20 level of production, the government would be well advised to take a hard look at what caused the slowdown before the pandemic, and then come out with a clear statement of a set of mutually supportive policies that will counter these forces and lead to higher growth and higher employment. It should also come out with a target for post-pandemic growth. Thank you. Editorial 6. Reimagining examinations. Disruptions caused by the pandemic call for innovative and holistic methods of assessment. N. Arunachalam. For students, empowerment and acquisition of knowledge begin when they are properly evaluated in an appropriate examination system through a process that provides immediate results and success. The online pattern of examination should not only judge intellectual development, as is prevalent in the present-day examination system, but it must also test the holistic development of students. It is the responsibility of every academician and authority to find the ways and means to conduct online examinations with reliable standards amid the COVID-19 pandemic. To successfully complete examinations during this period, constructive strategies, particularly in the online mode, should be employed, rather than calling for the cancellation of exams. The Supreme Court had stated last year that students in higher education cannot be promoted without writing the final year or terminal semester examinations, and a directive to the University Grants Commission, UGC, had said the states cannot promote students based on internal assessment or past performance. The court made it clear that the states could, under the Disaster Management Act, 2005, postpone final year or final semester exams, but they did not have the power to direct universities to promote students based on prior performance, as students' assessment was the prerogative of the UGC. The UGC rules clearly stated that a degree cannot be granted without examinations. Inclusive ways. It is now mandatory that final year semester examinations should be conducted either online, offline, or a combination of both methods. Therefore, a new examination pattern should be crafted. It must include the assessment of educational objectives of understanding, critical and independent thinking, problem-solving ability, reflective thinking, skill development, and application of knowledge. In other words, a revised system should assess analytical and application skills, rather than mere knowledge in a given time slot. This would enhance the quality and competence of students. To restrict copying, answer scripts may be assessed using plagiarism software. With technological tools, monitoring and supervision of students during online examinations is not a difficult task. Many of the world's leading universities, some premier Indian institutes, and a few state universities conduct examinations online efficiently and fairly through suitable tools. Looking for alternatives. An alternative approach may be open book examinations. It allows students to refer to textbooks or other source material while answering questions. Students are provided with questions before sitting for the exam, and they can even complete the test at home. This will help counter rote learning, which pervades the current examination system, while also sensitizing students to real learning and analytical and application skills. Open book examination is a well-accepted concept in many countries around the world. Last week, the Supreme Court directed states that have cancelled Class 12 examinations of their respective boards to spell out their assessment plans. It has also cleared the evaluation criteria proposed by the Central Board of Secondary Education, CBSE, and the Council for the Indian School Certificate Examinations, CIS, for their Class 12 examinations. Testing the knowledge gained and the presentation of that is the essence of education. As Jiddu Krishnamurthy said, it is not that you read a book, pass an examination, and finish with education. Criticism should be accepted constructively in order to frame an innovative examination system. It is the foremost responsibility of policymakers and educationists to tackle the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. N. Arunachalam is Professor of Lifelong Learning, Journalism and Mass Communication at Alagappa University. Thank you. 50 years ago, 1st July 1971, Soyuz cosmonauts returned dead. Moscow, June 30th. The 3 Soyuz cosmonauts died today under mysterious circumstances while returning to Earth, turning their record-setting 24-day space odyssey into the worst tragedy in more than a decade of spacefaring by man. The cosmonauts whose tragic end plunged the world in sorrow were Lieutenant Cole Georgy Dobrovolsky, flight engineer Vladislav Volkov, and test engineer Viktor Putsev. The trio, who had been in space for more than 3 weeks, separated from the Salyut orbital station last night for the return to Earth. The return flight was going according to plan when radio contact was lost after the ship's braking system for re-entry to the atmosphere was switched off. Soyuz 11 was slowed down by the atmosphere and the parachute system put into operation before landing. The soft engines were fired according to plan and the craft landed smoothly in the preset area. A helicopter-borne recovery crew, who landed simultaneously with the Soyuz 11, opened the hatch and found the 3 cosmonauts in their seats, with no sign of life. 100 years ago, July 2, 1921, archives for 1st July 1921 were not available. Women's suffrage. Mrs. D. Gina Rajatsa writes, "The fact of the enfranchisement of the women of the Madras Presidency has now become known to the world and messages of congratulation are coming in, many of them being received by the Women's Indian Association, which, being an organization linked to the international societies, forms a link between the women of India and the women of the rest of the world. The message that we very much value and appreciate is that from Lady Constance Lytton, the daughter of the late Viceroy of India, who for many years did the most splendid work in England for the enfranchisement of the women of that country and devoted herself absolutely to the cause of freedom and progress of women. She writes, please offer the women of South India my most heartfelt congratulations on their winning the vote, that is if there is an assembly to receive such congratulations. I am thrilled by your splendid letter about it and it seems like a dream the way the experience in our own island has borne wonderful fruit. Thank you. Faith. Eyewitness account. Valmiki's Ramayana is known as Adikavya, because it was the first Kavya to be written. Although many other Ramayanas came to be written later on, Valmiki Ramayana is special, said M. A. Venkatkrishnan, in a discourse. Sage Nada visits Valmiki, and Valmiki then puts a question to him. He lists 16 good qualities, and asks if anyone alive at that time has all these qualities. Nada says that Rama has all these qualities. Brahma then enables Valmiki to see all the events of the Rama Avatra, past, present and future. Because of Brahma's boon, Valmiki is witness to everything that takes place during the Rama Avatra. His Kavya, therefore, is an eyewitness account of what happened. It is nothing but the truth, with no additions or deletions. The Vedas are to be understood with the help of Itihasas and Puranas, and Itihasas are more important than the Puranas. However, some events described briefly in the Ramayana are elaborately described in some Puranas, and so, at such times, Vaishnava Acharyas have used the descriptions given in the Puranas. For example, Padma Purana gives the Kaksura episode in more detail than one finds in Valmiki's Ramayana, and Acharyas have quoted from the Padma Purana. The Ashtaksara mantra, Dvaya mantra and Charma sloka are significant for Sri Vaishnavas. And the Ramayana shows us the importance of Dvaya mantra, for it shows the inseparability of the Lord and his consort. The Ramayana makes us realize that we have to approach the Lord only with the blessings of his consort. The Kavya shows us both the end to be attained and the means to attain it. The end is to serve him in Sri Vaikuntha. The way to achieve this is through surrender to him. The concept of total surrender lies at the heart of the Ramayana. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this video as a podcast. Do like, share and comment. Press the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to get new notifications. Thank you. Take care and stay safe. God bless you all. Jai Maa Bharati. To download news and editorials in MP3, follow us on Telegram, Virtual School Official. The link is provided in the description below.